Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Runeterra Report, Mastering Runeterra's weekly podcast filling you in on everything you'll need to know for the upcoming week of Runeterra at a breakneck pace. I'm your host, DarwinTheory, NA Masters player and two-time Seasonals attendee, here to guide you through the meta for the week of December 19th, 2022. I would like to apologize for having been away the last 2 weeks. Between my own personal life, my exam schedule, and Riot releasing a hotfix at the absolute worst time possible, I had to shelve the last 2 episodes. Despite that, though, we are back. I'm excited to jump right back in and let you know what's up with our new meta. I would also like to offer my congratulations to Drisoth for taking home the $1,000 Mastering Runeterra tournament this past weekend. We love you, Drisoth. Stay orthogonal, my friend. Without any further ado, let's dive right in and explore what you'll have to keep an eye on for this week of Runeterra. In this post-hotfix world, the top dog is without a doubt Aatrox's Girl Scouts, or Aatrox Quinn Vayne. The deck has an absolutely absurd-looking matchup spread, losing hard against Rumble Vayne, but basically nothing else. It has shades of what Cat Gwen's matchup spread looked like when that deck was unequivocally the best in the game, and as such, I'm compelled to believe that AQV is the current best deck in the game, and it's not really close. When it comes to deck building and deck techs, I would highly recommend playing one copy of Condemn if you aren't already. I've experienced for myself how devastating the swing from that card can be. With all of your scout units and Vayne-free attacks, you're guaranteed to get a 1-mana strike-off at a very critical moment. Also worth trying, and something we saw from many of the Demacia lists at Worlds, is a single copy of Silence and Suppress. The card will simply auto-win you some matchups, if drawn at the right time, by shutting down an important unit for a very low cost. Some people are using Tempting Prospect as a tutor card, which would do well to help you draw the Darkenharp on time to have a big impact with your Fleet Feather Tracker or Valor. I wouldn't run more than one, though. All in all, this mix of world-ending catastrophe and overpriced cookies is doing a remarkable job of dominating the meta, and it doesn't look to be slowing down anytime soon. All aboard the AQV train. And while we won't be seeing Quinn more than once today, and Vayne isn't coming until further down the list, Aatrox hates being out of the spotlight for too long, and as such is also featured in the second most played deck, Kayntrox. These pesky Darken and Cultists combine to form a scary mid-range deck that can consistently draw its win cons on curve and make life a nightmare for any control deck with their constant pressure, while also keeping the game alive against aggro burn strategies with their abundance of healing. AQV and Ginny are bad news, but this deck really shines against the up-and-comer Bandlebar, which really rose to prominence at Worlds as Teddy showed exactly what he can do with the deck. It should also be noted that Lurk is a bad matchup for this deck, since I'll be touching on that archetype later. There are a few cultist spells that are perhaps underused but perform very well in this deck. Primarily, the Expanse's Protection has seen more play since Worlds, and does perform very well in this deck, albeit usually only as 1 or maybe 2 copies. In a much smaller sample size, some players perform really well with the Violent Discord. It can be nice to have a cheap removal in these regions, and it's usually really unexpected. I know I've been blown out by it a few times, and I never saw it coming. Otherwise, though, this is a tight deck list, which does make sense considering how small your regions are. Ever since the nerfs to Unforgiving Cold and Blooming Cultist, Aatrox has not been the same. That being said, the deck is still 100% worth playing in the current meta, and it definitely stands a good chance against the rest of the field. Oh, Seraphine. Why is it that when there's trouble, it's always you? Seraphine Ezreal Victor Bandle City, also known as Bandlebar, skyrocketed in popularity after Worlds, and shows no signs of slowing down as the most dominant combo control archetype in the game. With some unfair-looking matchups against Red Gwen, Draven Jinx, Ginny, and Rumble Vayne, this is the deck to play if you want to stomp out the Noxians on the ladder. Unfavorable matchups into Aatrox decks, Sundisk, and Talia do kind of hold the list back, but really that's not enough to stop it from being one of the strongest forces on ladder and a deck that really helps define the current meta. This deck is composed almost entirely of one-ofs, and as such it can be a bit weird to tech. I would say make absolutely sure that you're running probably only one copy of Hexsplitterator, Caustic Riff, and Puzzling Signposts. I've actually been finding great success with one copy of Cosmic Binding as well, and in a small sample size, the stats do agree. Bandlebar isn't a huge fan of Aatrox, but when Big Red is taken out of the picture, this deck's performance is undeniably crazy. And our good old friend Red Gwen is still clinging on as one of the top dogs of the meta, albeit by a more tenuous hold than in the past. The deck stands a good chance against AQV, Rumble Vayne, Plunder, and Ginny, and it obliterates Sundisk and Ryze Bar, but it gets humiliated by Bandlebar, Jinx decks, Pirates, and Field Rush. If you aren't running the new 1-drop Crimson Pigeon, get on that right now. I'll touch on the card a little bit more later, but it's one of the best things to come to aggressive Noxus archetypes in months. Redeemed Prodigy has also surpassed expectations in this deck, since it can quickly rack up the Hallows decks if not dealt with immediately. That thing is a must-answer threat. Lastly, I've been an advocate for a full set of rearguards in this deck for ages now, and I'll continue to do so until I see it surpass 2/3 play rate. Red Gwen has been nothing if not consistent for several months now, and I really can't see it falling completely out of favor anytime soon, even if it's not the number 1 deck anymore. So, when you combine those top 4 archetypes, and include the versions of Aatrox Vayne that don't run Quinn, which are the 5th most popular archetype in the game, that's 50% of the meta right there in terms of play rate. I will touch briefly on other important decks, but those 4 are by far the most important right now, and the ones you should be planning your laddering strategies around. Well, Draven Jinx discard is back, abusing the new Crimson Pigeon and Reveler's Feast to get some crazy stats on the board at a ridiculous speed. The Pigeon has to be dealt with right away, or it just grows out of control at an unfair speed and starts trading 2 for 1 or chipping crazy amounts of Nexus damage. The deck slightly loses to Aatrox decks and gets embarrassed by Bandlebar, Plunder, Aatrox Shadow Isles Control, and Jinx Lulu. On the other hand, it handedly beats Red Gwen, Sundisk, Ephemerals, Ginny, and Lurk. I think that this deck is a bit of a bully deck and probably not at the top of the meta, but I used it to climb to Masters this season, and as such it holds a special place in my heart. Try including some more traditional Noxus aggro cards like Legion Saboteur, Legion Rearguard, and Precious Pet. The discard synergies are nice and all, but these cards undeniably spike your win rate, and they felt pretty good for me to play with. I would also recommend one copy of Parts Made Whole, which isn't making waves in America, but elsewhere performs very well. This card has been very malleable through the years, going through several major changes to the deck list, but it seems like this is an archetype that might never really go away completely. And speaking of decks that refuse to go away, Lurk has stayed on the fringes of the meta the past few metas in a row. Always the 8th or 9th most played deck, but never really all that relevant. It's historically been known as a mid-range slayer, however, and we're really seeing that come to fruition right now. Aatrox hates Lurk in basically every variation. This deck actually likes Chamber of Renewal a lot to power up your Rek'Sai or Pike, and also does well with single copies of Ruthless Predator and Rite of Negation. It's not great against anything else, but it's very good at answering Aatrox specifically. If your pocket meta is all big red, try out the Lurkers. It'll treat you well. And Plunder, as per usual, is very good at one thing. That thing being not losing or winning any of its matchups. Okay, that's an exaggeration. It does have very polarizing winning matchups against Discard and Lurk, and very polarizing losing matchups against Kayn, Trounce, and Aatrox Shadow Isles, but in general, this deck tends to neutralize most matchups and make them winnable, creating a situation more reliant on skill than on inherent deck interactions. Babbling Bjerg is a classic card in this deck to tutor your champions, and Crackshot Corsair helps to ensure Plunder procs without wasting your ping spells on offensive turns. Those things are valuable. I would also recommend considering one copy of Field Rush to help close out games against decks that can effectively stall you. I myself have noticed a little bit of trouble closing out winning situations on this archetype. And it's weird to see a face like Rumble Vayne back on top of the show, but when one tumbles with a Rumble, they do tend to see favorable results in a meta like this. The deck slightly loses to Bandlebar, Kayn, Trounce, and Red Gwen, which sounds bad, I know, but it absolutely runs over AQV, and even more so the Quinless variant, whilst crushing many of the fringe meta options underfoot. The best options to try out for techs, by the stats at least, are Might, Catch, Condemn, and Bloody Business. If you want to target Big Red and Demacia, try tumbling your Rumble. And Aatrox Shadow Isles Control is also growing in popularity, and quite an interesting idea, but the data's a bit small for me to tell you much right now. There's a Thresh version and a Kindred version. It seems good, or at least even, into most of the meta top dogs, and I would keep an eye on it throughout the week. I've been seeing it more on ladder, and I think this thing might really start to gain some traction as time goes on. Alright friends, it's that time once again. The Radioactive Hazard Pile is back, and I'm excited to showcase some of the most rancid decks the current meta has to offer for those folks who would like to sacrifice their LP. To get me started, Sundisk seems to be a total bait archetype. While the King of the Rock Dudes, Rockbear Shepherd, does provide a lot of synergy to get your disc ticking, the deck just doesn't perform well into basically any of the meta. You do beat Bandlebar, but you get steamrolled to a hilarious degree by both Aatrox decks and Red Gwen. It's a bully deck that I really wouldn't recommend playing when the top 4 archetypes make up 50% of the meta. Ephemerals has some new toys to play with, but the matchup spread's perhaps even worse than Sundisk. I would highly recommend staying away if you value your LP. Sorry Hecarim, it really might be off to the glue factory this time. Ryze decks are still trash, and Ryze Yi might be the trashiest of the trash. Majin, I'll give you credit for performing on this dumpster fire. 36% is hysterically bad, and I don't know if this archetype can be saved by any techs. Ryze saw all of his decks with their sub 40% win rates, and unfortunately was driven to alcoholism, making some of his friends at the back alley bar. Now that deck is slightly better, but 43% is still just too low to even consider recommending. Zig's Acolyte's Reliquary is basically dead after the nerfs, and if you're an aggro player, Ginny is far from your best choice. You have other options. We still don't really have any good Kale decks either. I mean, Kale Bard is beyond terrible, and the new Kale Zed thing is halfway decent, but 45% isn't a really encouraging sign. We still need to wait to see really good Kale and Ryze decks, but Alcoholic Ryze and Zed Kale are the best ones to try right now if you're really desperate to try a new champion who isn't Aatrox. Well, everyone, that'll be just about everything for this week's Runeterra report here on Mastering Runeterra. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening right until the end. If you have any questions or concerns about the podcast, please feel free to hit me up through the Mastering Runeterra Discord server or personally at DarwinTheory9305. Massive shoutouts to MasteringRuneterra.com for making this happen, as well as every individual affiliated with the site who helped me piece together the data needed for this podcast. Other special shoutouts go to the folks behind LOR.GG, as well as Legna's website for matchup data. Gathering data isn't easy, but when I can cross-reference with such reliable sources, it's a massive help to make sure that I know that what I'm talking about is correct. The folks at Mastering Runeterra post quite often, so if you aren't already a regular, I'd highly recommend you swing by and see what's in store. We've got meta tier lists, matchup spreads, and a best of 3 ban helper for all you tournament players out there, all updated every few hours to ensure that we've got the best data out there. We also have articles posted by top players who know their stuff nearly every single day, so you'll be sure to find something you like no matter where you look. This has been your host, Darwin Theory, and on behalf of everyone at Mastering Runeterra, I'd like to thank you for tuning in and wish you all a successful week of laddering. I hope to see you next week, when we wait with bated breath to see if we will ever get a halfway playable Ryze deck, or if Aatrox ends up having less than a 25% share of the meta. Happy climbing!